Welcome to the fourth edition of the Asia-Europe Initiative, Stability and Security in the Indo-Pacific, the US, Japan, the EU, and the elephant in the room. This event gathered leading experts from Europe and Asia, the Asian-European think tank, to discuss the increasing geopolitical interest in the Indo-Pacific region. This initiative is comprised by a public roundtable, today, this one, and two closed-door workshops. I am Filippo Fasulo, I am the chair of today's roundtable. The title of this roundtable is Setting the Sail for Indo-Pacific, the Search for a New Pivot to Asia. So we have with us a terrific panel with outstanding scholars from Europe and Asia. In alphabetic order will be with us Mathieu Duchatel, Director of the Asia Program from the Institut Montaigne. Good morning. Michito Tsuruoka, Associate Professor from Keio University. Hello. Gudrun Wacker, Senior Fellow Asia Division from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And Yu Jie, Senior Research Fellow on China, Asia Pacific Program, Chatham House. Hello. So thank you for being here with us. And let's start with the seminar. So we all know that now we are experiencing a very bad time, and our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people. During our discussion, there will be time, and probably we will try also to understand how what is happening in Ukraine might affect the Indo-Pacific region. But first of all, we need to clarify what is going on in the Indo-Pacific, especially from the European point of view. So let's start with the first round of questions and with Gudrun Wacker. On your opinion, how did Europe get involved into Indo-Pacific, and what are the pillars of this strategy?
Let me start by saying that, of course, Europe, the European Union, have been involved in the region that is now called Indo-Pacific for a very long time already. We have very strong trade and investment relations with the countries in the region. We have strong diplomatic relations, and also we're one of the biggest donor of developmental cooperation in Southeast Asia and in South Asia. So what I want to say is that the Indo-Pacific is a construct, just like the Asia-Pacific was a construct, or Eurasia is a construct. And the definitions of the Indo-Pacific also still differ from country to country, for example, in terms of the geographic space. The European Union did pick up this concept relatively late. If we think that then Prime Minister Abe from Japan spoke about the confluence of the two oceans first in 2007, and the Europeans or the EU started to discuss the concept in late 2020. We are really latecomers. The first European member state talking about and embracing the concept was France, and Mathieu will talk about the French position, so I will not address this. It's also notable that this was a very unusual process for the European Union, since it was the initiative of some member states that drove this process forward at the EU level. So it was sort of a bottom-up process. And this explains why we have the Council conclusions on the Indo-Pacific first in spring 2021, and then later in the year, the joint communication. So this is really the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific. The initiative came from France, Germany, and the Netherlands, who all had composed papers on the Indo-Pacific, and they sought support from some other member states and then pushed this on the agenda of the European Union. And it underlines the significance, not only in economic terms, but also in geostrategic terms, of the Indo-Pacific region, that the EU has, is taking note with this strategy. The overall goals, so the main pillars, are basically, one, to strengthen partnerships that reinforce the rules-based international order, and second, to address global challenges to make possible a rapid, just, and sustainable recovery. So the European strategy also takes into consideration the effects of the pandemic on the economy. And so this is taking in new developments that also affect the region very heavily. There are several priority areas of cooperation where the EU wants to get more engaged, mentioned in the paper, such as sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, ocean governance, connectivity. You might have heard of the global gateway, this new concept of the EU for, improving connectivity, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but in other regions of the world as well. Then security and defense. There might be a maritime presence in the future, and human security. There is also sort of an action plan in the EU strategy that focuses on traditional instruments that the European Union has in its toolbox, like free trade agreement, partnership and cooperation agreements, and a whole plethora of dialogue formats. Priority will be given to countries that already have formulated their own Indo-Pacific strategy, because not all the countries in the region have embraced the concept. Only some have, some call it a little different. So these countries will be given priority. And the idea is to formulate or come up with some flagship projects that have a high visibility and a high impact, and then operationalize this concept or the strategy of the Indo-Pacific. And this was mainly to be done under the French presidency of the EU. A first forum, a meeting of the foreign ministers has taken place recently, but this is also something that Mathieu will address, because the forum took place in Paris, and probably I'll leave it at that for this first round.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned France, and we all know that France is one of the most active actors for Europe in Indo-Pacific. On February 22nd, there was the Ministerial Forum on Indo-Pacific Cooperation. So I want to ask to Mathieu Duchâtel, what France want to get from its Indo-Pacific policy, and these Indo-Pacific policies from France will impact also its China policy?
Thank you. Very good question, and I will try to complement Gudrun's points. You speak of gains, French gains in the Indo-Pacific. I think the initial perspective of the French was more defensive, and the reason why France was an early proponent inside Europe for an Indo-Pacific strategy was very simply the fact that France has an exclusive economic zone in the Indian Ocean and an exclusive economic zone in the Pacific Ocean, and low-level disputes that concern the integrity of this EEZ. So there was early on, in the mid-2010s, this assessment that Indo-Pacific can be pushed as a concept to anticipate threats and risks to the French EEZ, and that the question of the maritime order and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was very central to the defense of French interest in the Indo-Pacific. But the French position evolved from that starting point. And even though I think the defense of those interests remain very central and remain the core, the French approach has become more encompassing of other issues. And if I had to rationalize and list what are the key French strategic interests right now with regards to the Indo-Pacific, at the risk of over-rationalizing, perhaps I'd say there are three. Number one is to build a more geopolitical Europe. I think that has been the characteristic of President Macron's foreign policy since he came in power. And of course, the Russian aggression of Ukraine will perhaps do more than the advocacy for a European approach to the Indo-Pacific to get closer to that outcome of a geopolitical Europe. And I think that there are very difficult questions ahead of us as we are moving to a more geopolitical European Union. A lot, of course, will depend upon the future security architecture of Europe and of the difficult questions I can think of. Let me just make two. I think, what kind of actor will Germany become in the Indo-Pacific when Germany has increased the level of its defense expenditure to about 80 billion euros per year? I don't really have the answer at this stage. It's a very new development. Second question, do we seriously think that we can convince the Eastern European countries to see the Indo-Pacific as a securities theater in which they want to become a player? I think there are lots of uncertainties. There were uncertainties before. There are more uncertainties right now. The second French strategic objective, I think I would phrase it as contributing to build an order in the Indo-Pacific that is not purely defined by the US-China rivalry or by a US-China bipolar choice. And here, I think it's important to stress the importance of multilateral diplomacy. And the forum, the ministerial forum that the French presidency of the EU held in Paris 2 weeks ago was a very clear statement of intent regarding the importance of multilateral diplomacy. And you may contest that there will always be criticism that multilateral diplomacy is slow, is not very efficient, that it doesn't really get things done. But I think that the thinking, at least in Paris, is that multilateralism has a role to play in creating a positive dynamic in the region, also to generalize agreements and consensus that are being built in smaller formats, but also to help keep the focus of regional politics on issues of global governance that are different from the area of great power competition. And clearly for France, this is about creating alternative options and choices. And if you look at it from a strategic perspective, I fully agree with Gudrun's point that we will need to see positive projects that follow international rules, especially when international law is challenged in Europe and elsewhere. And I think that, second point regarding multilateralism, that Europe has a role to play to avoid that countries in the Indo-Pacific region are in position to avoid traps of excessive dependence and the risk of coercion. And I'd say there's a third objective, and I would describe it as very simply, a balance of power vision of the Indo-Pacific. And this may sound contradictory to my earlier point regarding multilateralism, and it may contradict the notion that France is promoting some sort of a third way in the sense of neutrality. I think France has a military balance and a balanced power approach to the Indo-Pacific. And that's about maintaining a naval presence in the South China Sea to construct an environment in which China is more constrained to unilaterally change the status quo. I think it's important. And there have been many deployments of the French Navy in the Indo-Pacific region in 2021. And there is also, a French-specific contribution to the military balance through arms exports to countries in the region that seek that kind of support from European countries. And so, it's obvious that France or other European countries will not be decisive game changers when it comes to the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, but I would not dismiss those contributions as not relevant to the overall balance in the region. I think it's about constraining choices, making choices more complicated. And that's my third and final point regarding the French approach.
Thank you very much. So we started from the Indo-Pacific, and then we mentioned many times China, the elephant in the room maybe we mentioned at the beginning. So now I will ask you, Jie, from your point of view, what is China's position on European new interest or European interest into the Indo-Pacific in the region, and taking a positive side of the point, how China can turn Indo-Pacific into a chance for cooperation and not only a general policy for containment? Please.
Thank you, Filippo. Firstly, let me thank ISPI colleagues to have invited me here, and also delighted to see many European colleagues, which I'm familiar with, are now sharing the same panel. Really delighted to be here. Now, I must say, this is representing a personal view, not necessarily an institutional point of view or governmental point of view. Now, as for China, I think the responses to Indo-Pacific seems to be quite late in a way, that actually for the first time I heard the Chinese government openly denounce the Indo-Pacific initiative that is really back to 3 weeks ago. Sounds like quite a short period of time. 3 weeks ago when Beijing and Moscow made the joint declaration that openly denounced the Indo-Pacific strategy launched and led by the United States, as China viewed this as almost like a sense of building an Asian version of NATO that tried to contain China's ever-increasing economic and political influence within the region. Now, that is just the Chinese government's view. But on the other hand, my personal view is that the Indo-Pacific strategy put forward by the United States is almost present as a very difficult diplomatic test for China, and especially for China's foreign policy. Because on the one hand, that China would be able to enjoy its economic power, that with enormous economic and financial resources, that be able to utilize and to extend its political influence within the region, that way of practicing economic statecraft. For example, that China has been a leading trading partner among many Asian economies. So if you're actually counting the ASEAN members, and also plus several which have signed up on RCEP, Regional Cooperation on Economic Partnership, that China is much larger trading partner with those members of RCEP than compared with the United States. So that is really at China's advantage, that to be able to utilize this trade and economic interdependence with those Asian economies, that be able to counter the influence that the United States have. But whereas on the other hand, I think the test and also the diplomatic balance come at a time when they come to the security discussions in here. I think that traditionally that Asian economies, and especially Southeast Asian countries, have always been associated with China economically, and that the United States has been part of the security architecture. Now, for me, it seems to, against the background of intensified competition between China and the United States, and I think that architecture will change quite significantly. So not only that China would be interested in become already an economic player, but also China would be interested in become a very strong maritime player as well. But however, I think the difficulties in here is firstly on the South China Sea issue, that China's activities with that sense of increasing sailing rattling activities around South China Sea, and firstly already make many Asian economies and ASEAN members very aware of China's motivations and activities over there. Now, secondly, this has become really a big headache for China is the Taiwan question, because essentially in the Pacific that included in Taiwan as well. So what Beijing is going to do about Taiwan, and that is also directly impact on how United States is going to respond on this Indo-Pacific strategy as well. So that's why I suggested is that a diplomatic test for China as well. But then also domestically, if we look into in the post-COVID period, that China as a country now has decisively to choose looking inward, that is less interested in foreign direct investment, less interested in offering further economic development assistance and so on and so forth. So I think China will choose very carefully where to put its financial resources. So on the one hand, you may see that China try to increase its economic ties with many Asian economies. But on the other hand, you see China choose very carefully on which sector that China wants to invest in firstly. And secondly, also asking the state-led companies, which make up the majority of the investment, foreign direct investment in the region to scale back and focusing on its domestic ground. So that is really presenting quite a nuanced picture in here, exactly what China chose itself to do within the region. Now, also lastly, I mean, when it comes to the domestic economic situation, there's also various interest groups within China that whether those interest groups are willing to participate in the so-called Indo-Pacific initiative and whether they are willing to continue to invest in the Asia-Pacific economy, and that is another question. At the moment that China is bidding its membership for CPTPP, even though I know that Beijing has a very strong determination to do so, but however, this is not only depends on Beijing's trade negotiator. This is also depends on whether the Chinese state-owned enterprises are willing to give up on those subsidies, and whether the Chinese government are willing to tell its state-owned enterprises want to give up those subsidies and therefore to meet the criteria of CPTPP. So also this is a domestic conversation within China that need to be had in order if China want to extend its economic and political influence within the Indo-Pacific. Now, for the area of collaboration, I would say the two areas that China, Beijing would be able to collaborate with either with the EU or with many other, whatever the regional initiative may put forward to. Firstly, obviously, is on the furthering the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, within the recent years, we seem to realize that Belt and Road Initiative now quiet down. And instead, Beijing has put forward a so-called Global Development Initiative by President Xi in September last year. And so far, the contents seems to be quite thin, and we don't really know exactly what are the concrete policy measures. But what I sense is that China is very much keen to share the financial risks of jointly developing any regional infrastructure projects. So this is not just a physical infrastructure, but also on connectivity, also on digital infrastructure. So I do not necessarily see the global gateway as a direct contrast or direct competition with China's BRI or the Global Development Initiative. So that's first thing. Now, secondly, also putting the regional perspective, this is also to do with the climate change, because climate change is the global public common. And if the climate change issue that in the Asia-Pacific region or Indo-Pacific region becomes so pertinent, and that would also do damage for China as well. So I would see these two core areas to go forward. The two sides, both the EU and China, will be able to collaborate. But how much collaboration, the substantial and the meaningful collaboration that two sides will be able to wage? But I think that's really largely depends on the political will of the both sides, because at the moment that Beijing and Brussels, in terms of its relationship, are not at its best term. So I'm not sure how much further the two sides can go, but surely that the willingness, I'm not sure, but areas for cooperation remains to be there. So I leave in here and look forward to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you to you, Jeff, for your excellent explanation. Very quite interesting, many things to discuss and many points for cooperation too. So let's move to Michito Tsuruoka. I just want to ask you, what is the Japanese view on the European Indo-Pacific strategy? And again, what are the main sources for cooperation between Europe and Japan on this point? Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be speaking to you this morning or this evening. Japan has been championing the idea of what is called FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. This is something that former Prime Minister Abe launched now nearly six years ago. So the idea of this strategy or concept or vision of FOIP has been evolving a lot. So it used to be that more understood as a more security-focused strategy, but in the meantime, it has become a more seen as a more inclusive framework. So in the context of FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, we even talked about potential cooperation with China as well. So Prime Minister Abe really wanted to make this a inclusive idea. So and in this context, the EU's strategy of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. It's something that Tokyo very wholeheartedly welcomed. So mainly because this is a great demonstration that Europe is now more committed to the Indo-Pacific region, not only in economic and trade terms, but also in political and security terms as well. And also we are seeing a lot of commonalities between the Japanese concept of FOIP and the EU's vision. So and particularly seeing from Japan, what strikes us is the fact that the EU's strategy is a great demonstration that it's going beyond China. So what I mean is that it used to be that the EU's Asia policy or Asia strategy was very much dominated by relations with China, and now what the EU, Brussels talks about is that it emphasizes relations with like-minded countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and also what is quite important is the fact that now the EU is very much determined to strengthen relations with ASEAN, because ASEAN, the Southeast Asian nations, very much those countries are very much situated just in the middle of the Indo-Pacific. So they're somewhere between the Asia-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region. So the strategic location of ASEAN itself matters quite a lot. And we very much welcome the increasing interest and increasing determination on the part of Europe to strengthen relations with ASEAN. And also the EU strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, also represents a EU's willingness to go beyond trade and economy. Of course, the EU has long been trying to raise its political and security profile in the region. But I think this a new Indo-Pacific strategy is a sort of a new step forward in terms of a strength in raising the EU's profile, political security profile in the region. As for areas, particularly for Japan, which is interested in the areas that Japan is interested in terms of thinking about more cooperation with Europe. And first and foremost, we are very much interested in maritime security and maritime issues, because the Indo-Pacific region, as the name suggests, is very much a maritime domain. So the freedom of navigation and other things are really crucial for us to think about the region. And in that context, of course, we very much welcome the fact that the increasing number of European countries are now sending naval ships to the region. But of course, this is a naval deployment. It's a really important and new sort of aspect of European engagement in the region, but we should not lose a sort of sense of proportion, because when we think about Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, of course the security component is there, and which is increasing, which I very much welcome. But the fact of the matter is that the EU matters in the region first and foremost, mainly because of its economic clout. So the fact that the EU is one of the biggest internal markets in the world, and also one of the biggest investors in the region, and also the EU is the biggest a donor in the field of development assistance, and those things and those foundations still matter, and that constitutes this. I believe that's still the biggest pillar of European engagement in the region. And in Japan, including myself, we tend to talk, I think, too much about security and defense component of this relationship. But still, the reality in Japan, on the Japanese side as well, is that our comparative advantage, Japan's comparative advantage, still lies in other areas other than security and defense. So the trade and economy and technology. And that is why the connectivity thing. So it used to be a connectivity strategy, and now it's part of the EU's global gateway strategy. And those areas is still very much I believe that one of the most promising areas for Japan-Europe cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. And what I believe is that it's really important and for us to prioritize the areas of cooperation for us, and also we need to be very realistic about where we have comparative advantage, added value. Because the naval deployment, I'm personally a huge fan of that, but still the EU there are other areas where the EU has more comparative advantage, like even in the security field. I think the cyber or space and these areas these are the areas where the EU can bring more to the table rather than just sending the naval ships. And also the security-related economic issues are also something that we are very much interested in deepening our cooperation. So economic security agenda, including diversification of a global supply chain, and this is the area where also that ASEAN plays a huge role. So that I very much believe that the Japan and EU or the individual European countries could cooperate more in Southeast Asia, and particularly regarding economic security agenda like diversification of global supply chain or the vaccination as well. So these are sort of a new area we can think of in the coming, I think, months and years. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiru Tsuruoka. We mentioned the fact that probably in Indo-Pacific we started talking about military issues, and then we shift to a more inclusive cooperation. So now I want to ask you, Gudrun Wacker, what about Germany? What is German view on the Indo-Pacific and China under a new government? And I would add, we just experienced that Germany is about to increase its military expenditure. So this kind of shift might be also relevant in other sectors related to Indo-Pacific or else. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start by saying that Germany published its guidelines, policy guidelines on the Indo-Pacific relatively late in September 2020. Under the previous government, of course, this was when the US elections had not happened yet, and we were sort of, this also informed the formulation of these policy guidelines. But it has to be noted that all ministries were involved. It's a cabinet-approved document, so it's sort of a whole government approach that the German government tried here. It published a progress report after 1 year, what steps had been taken in the year in between. And it's also important to say that the German policy guidelines from the beginning were meant as a building block for a EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific, just as the Dutch paper on the Indo-Pacific was meant as a contribution to an EU position, which is clear when you think, for example, of the trade dimension. Only the EU can negotiate free trade agreements. No EU member state can do this by itself. Now we have a new government, and this is a very new situation because for the first time it's 3 parties in the government, and this is a very interesting dynamic. It's still very new, and of course at the moment they are totally absorbed by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but we saw a few indicators what might come down on the Indo-Pacific. If I think back at the election in the platforms, it was only one party, the Green Party, that had a passage on the Indo-Pacific, but all parties addressed the issue of China. And then if you look at the coalition treaty, it basically says that the policy guidelines on the Indo-Pacific will be the basis for the policy of the new German government. And on China, it says we will cooperate wherever it's possible, but we will also push back because the systemic rivalry is an undeniable fact. by the way, what Yujie mentioned about climate change, I mean, the Green Party is in this coalition government. And of course, this is one of the topics where they still think it more in terms of cooperation with China than in terms of systemic rivalry. Also, we have to take note that for the first time ever, a coalition treaty mentions Taiwan as a topic and Hong Kong. This has never been the case. I mean, usually the part on foreign policy is not very long because it doesn't make you win the election, and it's less important, so to speak, than the domestic politics. But we cannot separate this very clearly anymore. Our new foreign minister, who is from the Green Party, gave an interview before she was sworn in, where she basically said that Angela Merkel's China policy, when it started 16 years ago, it was still adequate to deal with China, but then it didn't adapt to the new reality on the ground and the new developments in China under the leadership of Xi Jinping. So there needs to be a change. In contrast, the new Chancellor Scholz from the Social Democratic Party probably stresses more continuity than sort of abrupt changes in policy, although we have just seen last Sunday that my government made a complete U-turn on many things based on the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and I will come back to that in a minute. There is a plan to formulate a China strategy. We have no paper at the moment that encapsulates our position vis-a-vis China. We just keep repeating the three components that are in the EU strategy paper: cooperation, competition, systemic rivalry, but we have no strategy paper. So this is in the making. It will be very strongly embedded in the EU strategy. But the real question on China policy will be who is in the lead, who will basically direct China policy. Will it be the Chancellor's office, as it has been the case in the previous governments, at least since Helmut Kohl? It was always decided in the Chancellor's office and not so much in the foreign ministry. So how this dynamic of the three parties will play out, this will probably also decide how we will, where we come down in the balance between the cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry issue. Mathieu mentioned the new announcement, the announcement of the German government to raise our military expenditure to more than 2% of our GDP. If the GDP keeps shrinking, that might not mean very much, but there is this announcement with the 100 billion euros special funding for the military. My first question here is, will we be able to even absorb this? I mean, how will this be translated? Because our army has been neglected for so many years now that it will be very hard, and there are bureaucratic obstacles, etc. So this will be a huge challenge. But I'm hopeful that this really was a watershed moment that Germany cannot lean back and try to not take sides and etc. But we don't know how this will play out. And one fact remains, and that's that the German army is not. It's a parliament party. It's the German parliament that has to decide on every mission this army is sent to in the world. People tend to forget that because it's not the usual thing. But you could see that with the frigate Bayern that was sent to the Indo-Pacific, it had no mandate from the German parliament, and therefore it was kind of a very weak mission in terms of signaling. And this will not be changed even with the new decisions on, military expenditure and the new stronger position of the German government.
Thank you. Many relevant points. For example, one question about who is in the lead on China policy. The same question might be posed even at the European level. And so I just want to get back again to Mathieu Duchatel. We already mentioned France's stance on Indo-Pacific, but I would like to ask you something more specific about the AUKUS affair. So this affair belong to the past, or is still affecting European views towards traditional allies? So what is changed anything with AUKUS, or we are still friends there and anything can go along without any other issues? Please.
Yes. Well, I don't think it escaped anyone that Indonesia has raised in importance on the list of strategic partners for France in the region, and that the Franco-Australian relationship has not fully recovered from AUKUS, which really came as a shock for the French foreign affairs and security establishment. I don't think that this impacts the way France defines its interest in the Indo-Pacific region. And in particular, I would say, and I would pick up on one of the points made by Michito, that perhaps the most interesting story from the perspective of French foreign relations related to the Indo-Pacific is the fact that, with the rise of the Indo-Pacific concept, France has developed new strategic partnerships with key powers in the region. And that's the story of France's relations with Japan, India, of course, Australia, and maybe something is happening currently with Indonesia. And I think that's something to keep in mind, for example, especially now that the French Foreign Ministry makes references to the notion of ASEAN centrality and converge with Germany in using that language, which is a new development in French foreign policy. I think the thinking may be a little bit different there, because what remains central in the French thinking regarding the Indo-Pacific region is the sum of key bilateral relations to strike some sort of a balance. And for a country like France, that was so Sino-centered previously when it came to its Asia policy, that's a very significant development. Now, the things that change in relation to AUKUS, I think there is clearly a question regarding nuclear submarine programs in the region and what states will decide. I think the French thinking regarding the Australian nuclear attack submarine has been very cautious and almost pessimistic until a very recent date. There was this question whether, the Australian public would accept, after the period of 18 months to negotiate technical specificity of the program, what they would learn regarding, the cost of the submarines, how nuclear reactors would be handled in Australian waters, the division of labor between the Australian naval industry and the British and the American shipbuilding industries, and also the level of tech transfers, because we don't know about those things. Now it looks like the changing international environments may slightly change that assessment, because the argument becomes, even more convincing for the Australian Prime Minister to move ahead with a difficult program politically. But I think that what really changes is, the way other countries in the region approach the possibility of developing nuclear attack submarines, because they are a very efficient system to maintain the status quo in the region in terms of anti-surface warfare and also anti-submarine warfare, the capacity to conduct ground attacks. It's a very, very unique system, and one that may become more desirable for countries such as Japan and South Korea. I'm thinking of, in particular, of Japan and South Korea, but this could also result in India accelerating its own program. And there is a big question for India regarding, the sources of the Indian nuclear attack submarines and ballistic missile submarines, since India has the ambition to develop both. So in other words, my key point here is that what AUKUS changes in that regard is that the constraints that states were placing on themselves to transfer that kind of technology may weaken over time as a result of AUKUS, but also as a result of a changing international security environment. And final point regarding transatlantic relations, and in particular, US-France relations. I think, trust has been damaged to some extent, but not to the extent that Franco-Australian trust has been damaged, because the foundations of the relationship are much deeper, and the level of cooperation is also much deeper. And in fact, after AUKUS, an interesting agreement regarding naval cooperation was signed with the United States. I think the key question for me, looking forward to future developments in US-France relations, is the extent to which the US will agree that some French autonomous actions in the Indo-Pacific are also in the interest of the United States. And that is, in fact, not a given. And, I think that's also one of the lessons from AUKUS, that autonomous action by other parties is not necessarily valued in the US as much as the countries in question thought it would. So that's really an important question for the future. It seems to me that it's in the best interest of the US to encourage and to value those sorts of contributions to the Indo-Pacific instead of taking actions that undermine them. And I think AUKUS has been one such actions, at least from a European perspective.
Thank you, Mathieu Deschâtel. We mentioned AUKUS, and then we talk about Australia and the US, but sometimes we forget UK. So I want to ask you, Jay, you are based in UK, you're based in London, and so also UK presented its strategy toward Indo-Pacific, UK tilt to Indo-Pacific. According to your opinion, can the UK tilt toward Indo-Pacific help the country in developing a new role within the international community after Brexit and in this current international scenario? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Filippo. Interesting question. Again, not speaking on behalf, far from the pretending here. The key thing is you need to be careful with the word of tilt and the pivot. Last year, the integrated review, so has been a year now since its publication, that the British government would very carefully use the word of tilt to Indo-Pacific. That means the UK will have to spare its very limited diplomatic and military and economic resources tilt towards to that region, which is to say that it's almost like a coordination with the United States Indo-Pacific strategy, but not necessarily paying sufficient financial resources to get involved within the region. And instead, and what UK is good at, and obviously UK is trying to playing that so-called global broker role that presents itself as being a soft power within the region. And therefore, the key items and key agenda that British government will be interested in, and firstly, bidding its membership on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. Again, given UK is very much a service-oriented economy, and that is actually very easy for the UK to join that quite advanced investment and trade pact. So CPTPP one member is one of the key areas that UK would like to working on. Now, secondly, because of all these Indo-Pacific countries and the former colonies of the UK, so the British government would much be interested in reviving its economic ties with the former colonies, and also to work together on the trade issues. Again, open a global market for the UK once already departed from the European Union. Now, also, on the areas on climate change is one of those key areas, and UK is one of the global champion on the climate diplomacy. So that is also one area that British government would be interested in working with. Overall, I think the UK would be much more interested in play a bigger economic and societal integration role within the region, rather than just present itself as pure and military partner with the United States. And therefore, I think for UK's betting is to seeking its own economic opportunities within the Indo-Pacific, whilst on the other hand, also coordinate with its allies and partners within the region, but not necessarily come through for itself as pure and military partner. So I think that's what really UK's intention is about, expanding its own market and expanding its own economic presence, and also trying to reposition itself, the so-called global Britain role in here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We say so that talking about Indo-Pacific is not only a military affair, but an economic issues as well. Michito Tsuruoka, so what kind of cooperation is possible between the Quad and the EU? So Quad starting as a military alliance, military initiative, and then maybe something else. So what kind of cooperation might be between Quad and the EU?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, as you say that the nature and the focus of the Quad is changing, has been changing. So when it was established, it was thought as a security framework. So in that framework, we have been doing various maritime naval exercises, and so we thought it as a defense and security group. But now, particularly over 1 year or two, we have been focusing more on economic security agenda in the context of Quad. So including a vaccination for COVID-19, and also the technology cooperation, and also the diversification of global supply chain is also something that we have been talking about in the context of Quad. So Quad is a flexible framework. So they're putting together Japan, the United States, India, and Australia. So it's a good framework. But what is important is that it's a flexible grouping, and also it is really flexible in the sense that it doesn't have any institutions, treaties between four countries, because it's just a voluntary sort of a flexible framework. So which means that we can cooperate with other countries in a flexible manner. So if there are other countries which are interested in cooperating with Quad, so all such countries are to be welcomed. So whether it's from Europe, or whether it's from the region, so Southeast Asian countries, of course, and also South Korea, of course, and so that we are really flexible. And the fact that our focus has shifted from hardcore security and defense issues to economic security agenda, I think makes things much easier for other countries to cooperate. But there's a sort of a big question why Quad has changed from a more security and defense focused grouping to a more a grouping working on more on economic security agenda. So that if this change or this shift of focus, it's something that 4 countries agreed or intended. It is good because there are various other agendas other than security and defense in the region to be tackled. But if this is not a intended consequence of the 4 countries or individual countries like Japan, the United States, Australia, then that causes some problems and concerns. And some people argue that the biggest reason why the nature of Quad or the main area of focus of Quad has changed had to do with India's unwillingness to deepen security and defense ties within this framework. If that's really the case, then that causes concerns. And this is also quite related to India's position regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So India abstained. The Security Council resolution condemning the Russia's actions, and that causes some concerns, and that causes some skepticism about the viability of the Quad as a forum for the 4 countries to cooperate. So but I understand that this is something for us to discuss in the next round of questions. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michito Tsuroka. Actually, it's quite interesting because, as said, you already mentioned something would be interesting to be addressed in this question. So I will ask Gudrun Wacker, if we go back to the current situation, to the current terrible situation. So what kind of implication we can see from the Ukrainian affairs, the Russian invasion to Ukraine, to the Indo-Pacific? So is there any impact in terms of alliance, in terms of interest, or else? 3 minutes for you, if you can, please.
Let me start by saying we're in the middle of this conflict, so we don't know how it will, in the end, play out. But already it is clear that it will have direct implications not only for us in Europe, but also for the region, because rising energy prices and, for example, food security, this affects the countries in the Indo-Pacific as well. A lot of the countries in the region are importing grain, for example, from Ukraine. This is also true for Northern African countries, for example. So there will be a negative impact of this conflict. And then, I mean, for the moment, I think the problem is that our governments are completely absorbed by this conflict, and there is very little sort of space to discuss anything else. So this is another question: what will this mean in the end for our Indo-Pacific policy guidelines in the case of Germany and the EU position? And what will it do to the relationship with China? And this will also depend on what conclusions China will draw from this experience, to put it in very neutral terms. I mean, China is in a pickle here, and they have tried to basically signal to both sides by saying integrity, territorial integrity and sovereignty includes also Ukraine, but on the other hand, they abstained. And there is the joint statement between Russia and China that was mentioned by Yu that begs the question: how much did the Chinese leadership know about Russian plans? I mean, if they were not informed beforehand, I would be not very happy if I were Xi Jinping. And the fact that it started one day after the Olympic Games were done hint very strongly that there was some sort of, coordination going on. So what will be China's response and what lessons will they draw? First of all, what does it mean for the narrative that the West is in decline? Because I think it was kind of surprising even to us how the West got its act together, that the European Union, I mean, with Germany dragging its feet, and I think it's good that France and Germany exhausted the last bit of diplomatic opportunities. But then, when it was clear that this didn't go anywhere, we got our act together pretty quickly. And what does China make of that? And then are they surprised about the local resistance? So what will be China's conclusions? Will it double down on its behavior in the region, or will it tone down its wolf warrior diplomacy, etc.? All of that we don't know yet. So overall, I think we're today not in a position to say what this means for our stance on the Indo-Pacific. I just hope we don't drop the ball again, because I think there is a connection between the two theaters, of course, and we cannot, because of geographic distance, start to think in these narrow geographical circles again, because what happens in the Indo-Pacific affects us very much. And if you look, for example, at how the ASEAN member states voted in the UN Security Council, ASEAN as such gave a very weak statement, but there were only 2 countries, Vietnam and Laos, that abstained, and the rest voted in favor of the resolution. So I think there is also room to try to talk to our Asian partners and Indo-Pacific partners about the situation, instead of turning our attention completely away from the region again.
Thank you, Gudrun Walker. Mathieu Duchâtel, do you agree that the two regions, Europe and Indo-Pacific, are very much connected? And also, do you agree with the fact that the West in some ways proved is not declining, or at least not totally declining?
Yes, thanks, and Gudrun really made very good points, which I mostly agree with. I would tend to think that indeed China is central to the connection between the Indo-Pacific theater and what is currently happening in Europe. And I would also tend to think, I would be, like Gudrun, very cautious regarding what we understand of how China approaches the current crisis. I have more questions than answers myself, including, regarding how much China knew regarding this so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the degree of granularity that was, shared by Russia regarding the sort of military action that it would be taking towards Ukraine. But what seems very certain to me is that what matters most for China is the political outcome of all this. And I think that, China can basically stay in the position of outsider to the crisis, make so far what constitutes vague offers regarding the possibility of being involved in a mediation, which to me, is a very, very uncertain development, that China would actually be central in mediation regarding the Ukraine crisis. But China can draw consequences from the crisis once it is over for its own Taiwan policy. And I think as much China is central to the connection to the two theaters, the Taiwan question is central to the Chinese perception of the outcome of the crisis. And here, there are different possibilities, and all factors matter. I think Gudrun mentioned, the capacity of the Ukrainian population to conduct resistance. I mean, this is something I have heard in Taiwan during previous trips, that to increase the capacity of the Taiwanese society to deter China from trying to solve the Taiwan issue by force, they would need to be able to demonstrate that they have the resolve to conduct that sort of resistance. Of course, there are many other operational considerations that are, serve as lessons for the PLA as it plans possible operations vis-à-vis Taiwan, because whether China does it or not, there are always operational plans being drawn, and it could go in both directions. That's why I am very cautious. It's clear that the cost is super high for Russia, and that's something also that will need to be taken into consideration. It's also clear that assessing the level of resistance that a population will engage in is a very tricky intelligence challenge, in fact, for any country. How do you predict that? There was clearly miscalculation on the Russian side, since we understand that the game was to conduct a blitzkrieg operation towards Ukraine. And that will have to be, very carefully calculated on the Chinese side. So I think in terms of considering options vis-à-vis Taiwan, this war in Ukraine is really, creating very important lessons for China. So, my cautious conclusion would be what matters most is the outcome rather than the conduct of the operations. And we are not there yet.
Thank you, Mathieu Duchatel. Yuji, what are your cautious assumptions about what is happening in Ukraine and implication on China Indo-Pacific?
Much agree with the two previous speakers in here as well. I think we can observe from the shift in tones of the foreign minister in Beijing from initial indifference into reticently want to play a mediator role. So I think this is just reflecting. So far, there has been no any agreement has been reached within Beijing, because otherwise they would have to put forward a very concrete and mediation plan. So that's just my first observation. Now, the second observation is, apart from the lessons learned within Taiwan issue, I think another lesson that the Beijing should have learned for this time is that try to do a balance sheet. Is really Beijing willing to associate itself with this international pariah state that entertain Russia's military adventurism on the one hand, and therefore putting Beijing into some sense of international isolation? Or on the other hand, maybe China would have a better opportunity to soften its diplomatic rhetorics and on its diplomatic approach towards the West, and take this opportunity and play a much greater mediator role. I'm much hoping for the second option to put on the table in here, and over medium to longer term. This will do positive to China's international image, and this will help China on its own international standing, which has been much damaged in the past few years. Now, also in the economic terms as well, that China has maintained relatively good relationship with both Ukraine and Russia. Now, China has been number one trading partners with both countries, and also Ukraine served as a very major grain and military equipment supply for China. So would China be interested in entirely damaging its relationship with Ukraine as well? And perhaps not. So I think at the end of the day, Beijing have to almost behave like a chartered accountant and try to work out on the balance sheet what are the assets and what are the liabilities of associating with Moscow in this case. And I think hopefully there'll be some cool head to prevail when it comes to the policy makings in Beijing at the stage. But I think in the medium to longer term, it is not doing China any favor as the war prolongs.
Thank you, Yuji. Michito Tsuruoka, you already mentioned the fact that India abstained from the UN Security Council, US General Assembly discussion on the issue. And so why this is important, and generally speaking, what's the Japanese point of view on all the issues?
Okay, thank you very much. So this time around, the Japanese government's approach has been very much aligned with the G7 partners, including, of course, the United States and Europe. So this is sort of a new development because the last time around after 2014 annexation of Crimea, the Japanese government at the time was really cautious in imposing sanctions against Russia because of the fact that at the time Prime Minister Abe was very much committed to improve relations with Russia and was very much committed to peace treaty negotiations with Russia. So Tokyo didn't want to provoke Russia too much at that time. But this time the situation is really different. So the more anger and the firmer approach you can see from Tokyo. And I think, so let me share you with, I think, two additional sort of lessons or observations. And one sort of a inconvenient lesson is that the crisis and the war demonstrate the fact that still the military power matters. So particularly those who are willing to use military power, they can do various things. So those who are not prepared to use force tend to be on a very defensive vis-a-vis those who are willing to use force, and that's just a inconvenient truth that we have found again during the crisis and following the outbreak of war. But at the same time, the good news is that the international community, particularly led by the United States and Europe, has demonstrated its ability to impose huge economic sanctions on Russia. So I believe that Moscow underestimated the West's ability to orchestrate this very strong economic sanctions against Russia. So the international community, I think, has demonstrated its capability to destroy the aggressor's economy. So this is a sort of good news, and also this is something that other potential countries which are maybe thinking about doing similar things against its neighbors. I think they need to realize the fact that this sort of a orchestrated economic sanction is still possible. So but of course we still don't know how this war unfold in the coming days and months. So we should not be we should not rush to any conclusion, but still we have been already been able to find some observations and lessons. Thank you.
We are actually running out of time, but we have many questions. So I will ask you if you can answer with 30 seconds on some of these topics. So I will ask Gudrun Wacker, what about ASEAN? We already mentioned ASEAN in all this discussion. So how do you read ASEAN response to the crisis?
Was to be expected that ASEAN as an organization will respond in a very weak way. This is not unknown to the Europeans, because we also have the consensus principle when it comes to foreign and security decisions. I think we should use this opportunity to talk to them, to individual countries. And what it also shows to me, the Singapore case, Singapore went way stronger, condemned the Russian invasion in very strong ways, and will have sanctions against Russia. That this dichotomic division of the world and in autocracies and democracies does just not reflect the reality in the region, and that we should have a more flexible and pragmatic approach. The fact that you're not a democracy in the Western sense does not mean that you don't have an interest in a rules-based international order, especially if you're a small or medium-sized country. You don't want the might makes right kind of principle at work.
Thank you. Mathieu de Châtel, your view on India's behavior, 30 seconds if you can. A tweet, as we usually say now.
No, it's a very important question, but I think it's been already addressed by Michito in a way. I think India has been focused on evacuating its own nationals from Ukraine. India is trying to preserve a key relationship from the perspective of its government with Russia when it comes to finding some balance with external partners, and as a result has abstained, creating tensions within the Quad. I think for me the most interesting question regarding India going forward is whether India can actually be part of international mediation efforts. I think that's the best outcome we can think of in terms of having India slightly evolve away from this position of neutrality, which in fact, in that particular case, is a position that creates political space for Russia to continue behaving the way it does towards Ukraine and towards Europe.
Thank you. Yuji, same question for you. Your view on India, as many people ask us about India. 30 seconds if you can. Thank you.
Well, obviously, India is a major power within the region. And the most important thing is that China would have to find a way to work with this gigantic neighbor one way or another. The current stalemate on its bilateral relations just can't sustain. And that would equally apply to China's diplomacy on many areas and with many countries within the region as well. Certainly, on the one hand, while you have this very toxic diplomatic rhetoric, the so-called warfare diplomacy, then on the other hand, you want to building up a trade relationship with all the major economies within the region. And sooner or later, this would really letting diplomatic war on words and harming China's economic interest. And over longer term, that is not very helpful for Beijing.
Thank you. Michito Tsuruoka, last few words for you. Today about ASEAN. So what's your view on ASEAN? The same question we posed to Gudrun Wacker at the beginning.
Yes, I think what is important now is to try to expand the number of countries which are on board in imposing sanctions, because we should not be seen as West versus Putin, but this is very much a international society versus Russia. So how many countries we can get on board is really important, and from that perspective, the getting countries on board from Southeast Asia is particularly important because of various connections that Russia has in the region, and also the increasing clout of those countries. So that is why I very much welcome the fact that Singapore has decided to impose financial sanctions against Russia. So this is I believe that it's in the interest of ASEAN countries to reaffirm the basic principles of international order, like respect for other countries' sovereignty, or the respect for other countries' territorial integrity, which is very much fundamental for those countries.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, we still have many other questions, but we run out of time. So I just want to thank our guests today, Gudrun Wacker, Mathieu Duchatel, Yuji, Michito Tsuruoka. It was very interesting discussion. I hope to see you quite soon again in person, as I said privately before, in Milan or wherever. So thank you and have a good day.